In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Christ is in our midst.
Il est et ever shall be.
Le Christ est parmi nous.
Il est et sera.
Christos posredie nas. Christos est con noi. Today I would like to direct your attention to the epistle reading, St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 4. In this chapter, we discover much about the relationship between St. Paul and the Corinthian church. The church at Corinth was a very affluent church in a very powerful commercial city. Ancient Corinth can still be toured in Greece. It's not very far from Athens. And we discover that the relationship between the founding apostle, St. Paul, and the church was sometimes strained, in part because they were doing things they were not supposed to be doing, and in part because it would appear that a number of the people in the Corinthian church were judging and criticizing St. Paul. This we can see from verses that precede the epistle in chapter 4, in which he makes reference to being judged by them. He says some very instructive things. And one of the most striking things that he says in the verses that we heard today is that he says, you have had, though you have many teachers in Christ, you do not have many fathers. And I became your father in the gospel, which is a very strong statement, but a stronger one is coming. Several verses later, we hear St. Paul saying, imitate me. Live as I live, in other words. And I suppose people reading this text from an entirely secular background would do typically a kind of sociological or political analysis of it, and would perhaps find the reference to imitating him, or the appeal to imitating him, as being quite shocking. Actually, I think some Christians gloss over the verse and simply think it's some kind of literary device, or that St. Paul's trying to create a particular impression. But clearly, this is not the case. He says, imitate me. Now let's go back and see why he could say that and what it means. First of all, he says you've had many teachers. Indeed, teachers were raised up from within particular Christian communities. Christian communities, parishes, they weren't called parishes yet, in the first century were urban. They were only found in cities. And so in the large city of Corinth, there was only one church, very different from our understanding of churches today, you know, where you go into a city and every several blocks there's a church. By the way, hopefully in Canada, every several blocks there's a church that's open, which is another story. But in any case, in the first century, one city, one church. And in each church, everything that the parish, that the community needed, was supplied for them. They had presbyters, they had a bishop, they had deacons, they had deaconesses, from what we know. They had active laity, and the presbyters were charged with the teaching in the community. And in these early Christian communities, there was never one presbyter, because it was a city church, if you like. There were a number of presbyters and a number of deacons. Among the presbyters, there was a protos, one who was first among the others, and that was the bishop. And so they were used to the idea of having a number of people teaching them, passing on the apostolic teaching. So that's what an early Christian community would look like. In the city of Corinth, it means that most of the people in the church were fairly affluent, although we know from St. Paul's letters that there was a certain segment of the church that was poor. And so he says you have many teachers, but he makes an appeal to the unique relationship, and when I say unique, I mean irreplaceable, a one-only relationship that only he has with that city church. There is already a bishop there, presbyters, plural, deacons, plural, people teaching, but only one person has founded that church, and that's St. Paul. He is the founder. He has almost certainly ordained the presbyters, deacons, and the bishop who is there. And so he has a special relationship with them. And he refers to that relationship as a paternal relationship, a relationship between a father and his children. And a good father knows how to love his children sacrificially, knows how to discipline them, is able to tell a child no, hearing, and is able to affirm his children. And you put all of that together, and you can see the relationship, the type of relationship that he has with them. He encourages them, he tells them no, and in many areas he's very specific. You must not do that. And he even says, I'm coming to take care of this. And you read the end of the chapter, it's really quite impressive. He says, ought to come with a rod? In other words, ought I come to discipline you? Please don't think he arrived with a rod and started beating people up. He means it more poetically. Ought I come to discipline you? And he says, and apparently there are some of you who think they are going to oppose me. I'm paraphrasing. And he said, I will see what they're made of, whether it is just talk or power. For what is important is not talk, but authority. So he's asserting his authority very clearly and telling them that certain behaviors were completely unacceptable in the community. And of course, first century people were not very different from 21st century people. People don't like it. People don't like it. Children don't always like it when fathers and mothers say no. And in this particular case, you can imagine in an affluent city, educated, rich people, and they want to live the way they want to live, and St. Paul says, you're not going to do that. And you have a conflict. Some of them accept his apostolic authority, and others dispute it. No doubt some said, he's not one of the 12, meaning we have found a good reason not to listen to him. And others accepted him by virtue of his unique relationship with the resurrected Christ, a very special one that we read about in the book of Acts, and because of his apostolic authority and apostolic teaching. His point is simple. Someone had to give birth to you in the gospel. You didn't just happen. Someone had to preach the gospel to you. Someone had to sacrifice in order to do that. If you read St. Paul's life, it is absolutely striking the suffering that this man went through. And when you read it, you understand how great the Apostle Paul is, how great he is, how many times shipwrecked, how many times imprisoned, how many times flogged, and each of the floggings done in first century Rome in such a way that not everybody survived. And he makes it through these, his entire body covered with the wounds of flogging is actually, in a certain sense, maimed for the sake of the gospel, wounded for the sake of the gospel physically. When you read the epistle, I want you to hear it. The apostles have become like dirt, filth. You can use a stronger word if you want, because St. Paul uses it. The garbage of the earth. And you are wise, and you are honored, and you are this. And so you can feel the tension, the hurt, the sacrifice. But based on his relationship with them, he says only one has fathered you in the gospel. And that doesn't just mean that he preached and, forgive me for using current language, took off. That means that he preached the gospel. That means that he stayed. That means that he gave his life. That means he invested everything that he was in those people. To say that St. Paul lived a sacrificial life is to drastically underestimate and underappreciate exactly who he was. And so what he's telling them is that you may have many people teaching you, you have a structure in your church, but you've only one apostle who's given his life in the way that he has, and has imaged Christ for you. And therefore he can actually tell them, imitate me. We might consider that as an arrogant statement. But think of it, take a step back. Would you tell someone else, would you tell a young Christian, if you want to know what it is to live the Christian life, imitate me? Think of it. How could he say such a thing if his life was not, in fact, exactly a life that could be imitated? And the striking power of the statement of a person who's not a megalomaniac, and who, in fact, is the exact opposite, who gives his life for the sake of the gospel, who suffers, and, of course, is martyred, ultimately, but his entire life is a life of martyrdom. So striking it is that someone could make a statement like that. In fact, every child learns to live life and the Christian life from his or her father or mother, or preferably both, if possible. That is the relationship that God has set up in families and in the church. Fathers, mothers, listen to what I'm telling you. This isn't a one-off when he says, I'm your father in the gospel. These kinds of relationships are God-given, and they exist on the level of the church, where a priest should become a father to his church. It isn't simply a term father, otec, oche, batushka, that we give for cultural reasons, or even for recognition of the person's office or ordination, that because he's a priest you call him father. You ought to be able to describe the relationship for real in the title. The same with the bishop. This is how it was meant to be. And certainly all of it comes from God the Father, because we image him. And the apostle images Christ as he gives his life for the church. And so he can rightfully say, imitate me. Not only is it possible for him to do that, but in a way it makes it easier for the Corinthian church, because they see how a person lives. In other words, I can teach you give you a book. But ultimately, if you watch how a person lives, how a person talks, how they think, what they do, it's by far the best lesson. It's an intimidating one for every parent, for every priest, for every deacon, for every bishop. But it's one that we ought to never forget, because when St. Paul says this, it shows us something very important in the church, that Christ did not leave his church without an image, without a pattern, without a character, without something that you could refer to so that you could know how to live. And so when he says, imitate me, there's something after it that I'm going to add. I dare you. St. Paul speaking, imitate me, I dare you. If St. Paul told me, imitate me, I would tell him, I can't. I can't. And it shook the Corinthian church. Imitate him, go hungry most of the time. Imitate him, be in dishonor. Imitate him, be the filth, the garbage of the earth. Imitate him, be flogged, be shipwrecked, be threatened. Indeed, he was one to be imitated, absolutely, because what could you see there if it weren't the humility of Christ and the self-giving love of the Lord? You see Christ in the apostle because he allows himself to be crucified. That's a father. It's almost unknown in our society. It's almost unknown. And so we read it as an interesting historical reference, instead of understanding that this is the way God wanted it in the church. That we ought to sit up, listen, and to consider the weight of St. Paul's words, to give thanks to the Lord for him, and to live as he lived.